Welcome in, everyone. It's the Dominator. I'm Josh Larky. This is the Week 3 Start Sit Show. Let's get right down to it. I've got 19 players that I'm either above or below consensus on the starts and sits of the week, and then I will leave you with a nice little underdog fantasy pick for entry. So far, we are 4-2 on our picks, but we haven't quite hit the full entry yet. But if we're hitting at a 67% clip, it's coming. Quarterback. I am above consensus on Joe Burrow this week. He's the quarterback 6. He's facing Washington. And it's just nice that we get him opened up here. I understand consensus likes him, but that just because consensus likes him doesn't mean all of you are going to start him. You have to start him. The Bengals have the highest implied team total on the slate against the Commanders. T. Higgins is likely returning this week. The run game's just been inefficient. I think they're going to have to lean on Joe Burrow to shred the NFL's worst pass defense. Joe Burrow's been bottom 10 in air yards per pass attempt this year. And I think some of that's a T. Higgins issue. Well, if we just look at the Commanders matchup, though, I mean, Daniel Jones just had the 5th highest air yards per pass attempt last week and nearly 3 seconds on it for his average time to throw. That's pretty high. So if Jones had the right environment, if you give Joe Burrow time and let him pass deep downfield, good things are going to happen. I think we're going to get some deep shots to T. Higgins downfield. Chase is going to dominate the short to intermediate area of the field. You cannot set Joe Burrow this week. I think his first 20 fantasy point week is happening week 3. Running back, I'm really above consensus. Then we'll get to a couple running backs a little deeper. But first, I just want to say, before we get to the guys that are like the fringe top 30 and below types, I love Tony Pollard right now. RB 18 consensus against the Packers. So let's talk about Pollard and why we just have to start him this week. So the Titans are quietly favored by 2 points in this game. The Packers allowed 8.5 yards per carry to Jonathan Taylor and over 9 yards per carry to Anthony Richardson last week. In week 1, the Packers allowed 109 rushing yards to Saquon Barkley. Tajay Spears is a little bit banged up. Tony Pollard had 19 touches week 1, 22 touches in week 2. Another year removed from that late 2022 season broken leg, and he just looks like his old explosive self. I think he's a fringe top 12 running back this week. All right, we're digging deeper here. Chuba Hubbard. He's the consensus running back, 29 at the Raiders. So week 1 against the Chargers, it was the nightmare. We know what happened in that game. It was hard to watch. Chuba Hubbard had 6 carries to Miles Sanders' 5. But then week 2, we saw Chuba Hubbard start to emerge again. And one sec, did I just get the matchup wrong? Sorry, Panthers Saints. As I was saying Chargers, I was like, that's wrong. Folks, we just corrected ourselves live on air. It was the Saints matchup week 1. Whew. It's a long season. We are only in week 2. Anyway, so the Saints was the nightmare matchup. He has 6 carries to Sanders' 5. The game's over like 1.5 quarters into that one. But then week 2, we saw Chuba Hubbard start to emerge when they weren't down by score after score after score at halftime. He had 10 carries for 64 yards. He even had 5 targets. Miles Sanders, he had just 7 carries for 20 yards. That's not 10 carries for 64 yards. We're seeing the split start to emerge. Sanders only had 3 targets. Chuba's looked like the better running back through 2 weeks, and now they turn to Andy Dalton. They've benched Bryce Young. Andy Dalton's a pocket passer with competence. And the Raiders' pass rush has pressured quarterbacks at a well above average rate, despite facing Justin Herbert and the Chargers' offensive line, and then the mobile Lamar Jackson and the Ravens. Now, under heavy pressure in this matchup against the Raiders, I expect Andy Dalton to have a lot of dump-offs to Chuba Hubbard. And small sample size again, but the Raiders have allowed the 2nd highest yards per carry to opposing offenses. Start Chuba Hubbard this week. I think he's a fantasy running back 2 with a much better floor than I think people realize. And then if we want to go deeper, we can start in PPR formats. Austin Ekeler, the RB 31 at the Bengals. He's 2nd right now in the NFL in running back receiving yards, 99 to Devon Achane. And he's been consistent too. He had 52 receiving yards week 1, 47 receiving yards in week 2. The Bengals are 8-point favorites over the Commanders. That screams to me a lot of passing by the Commanders has to happen. in comeback mode. We just saw Isaiah Pacheco catch 5 passes against the Bengals last week. And after just 2 carries in week 1, we actually saw Ekeler step up to 8 carries in week 2. So maybe there's a little potential on the ground even. I mean, Ekeler has 5 red zone carries on the season compared to 8 for Brian Robinson. Austin Ekeler, sneaky start in PPR formats. Let's turn to wide receiver. Jameson Williams is the consensus wide receiver 20 at the Cardinals. He's facing one of the NFL's worst pass defenses in the Cardinals. The Lions have the second highest implied team total on the slate. And Jameson Williams' role is just crazy for what we thought would be a speedy deep threat, where I think we were like hoping he'd be Rashid Shaheed. We were like, oh, please be Rashid Shaheed. Please get 3 or 4 catches a game for 50 to 60 yards. No. Jim was blowing that out of the water. 9 targets. He caught 5 for 121 yards and a touchdown in week 1. 11 targets. He caught 5 for 79 yards in week 2. He had a carry in each game as well. I have him as a fringe wide receiver 1 this week. Diontae Johnson. Start him. Consensus wide receiver 34 at the Raiders. Now, Diontae Johnson has 70% more targets than anyone else on the Panthers currently, and he's got a lower average target depth. So he's being targeted closer to the line of scrimmage than Adam Thielen and rookie Xavier Elliott. When Andy Dalton's under pressure from the Raiders, he's going to look for Diontae Johnson. This is the sneakiest player that I think is going to flirt with and succeed in flirting with. His 10 targets in week 2. Dalton's lone start last year for the Panthers, he threw for 361 yards and 2 touchdowns on 58 pass attempts. It was a wild 27-37 loss to the Seahawks. I don't expect that this week, but I do think the Red Rocket is in DGAF mode at this point in his career. And the Panthers players, the fans, they just want a fun offense for a few weeks. I think Andy Dalton gives that to them. I think Diontae Johnson gives you a fantasy wide receiver 2 performance. All right, let's dig deeper. We got 2 more guys. Michael Wilson, Cardinals. He's the wide receiver 64. He faces the Lions. So the Lions are once again, they're just begging, just asking slot receivers to carve them up. Week 1, we saw Cooper Kupp have 14 catches, 110 yards, and a touchdown. Week 2, Godwin had 7 catches, 117 yards, and a touchdown. Michael Wilson is not Cooper Kupp. He's not Chris Godwin. But he did run more routes out of the slot than Greg Dortch. He had more than twice as many routes out of the slot last week than Dortch against the Rams. If you need a desperation flex play, I would lean Michael Wilson, who I think is going to be starting in 2 receiver sets and then get a lot of these slot reps in the game with the highest total on the slate. Because I know a lot of you are desperate. I'm desperate in some leagues. I have a league where I drafted Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua and Hollywood Brown. I thought I'd get Hollywood Brown back for week 2 or week 3. Now I have no Hollywood Brown for the season. We've got Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp out for weeks and weeks. It's bleak out there. T. Higgins, start him. The consensus rankings are off for him. They have him at wide receiver 85 right now on Fantasy Pros. I think he's playing. It's a Monday night game, which is a little awkward, but what's nice is I think we should get like real strong practice report confirmation either later today, Thursday, when I'm recording this, or Friday for the practice reports. If he plays, you start him against the Commanders. I don't know where consensus will fall for him, but unless the Bengals are like he's on a 10 to 15 snap count, I think he's a fantasy wide receiver 3. We have to fire him up. Tight end, I like Kyle Pitts. He's the tight end 8 by consensus. He faces the Chiefs. The Chiefs have just gotten killed by tight ends this year. Week 1, Isaiah Likely had 9 catches for 111 yards and a touchdown. We remember that. Week 2, Mike Gesicki had 7 catches for 91 yards. I'm not done. Eric All, the rookie on the Bengals, had 4 catches for 32 yards. I'm not done. Drew Sample had 3 catches for 28 yards. I don't know what's happening over here, but the Chiefs right now are a factory for tight ends to do something. Cousins looked much better. He looked more comfortable in week 2 than week 1. It'll just take him a little time coming off the Achilles. I think Kyle Pitts has huge upside this week. I think he can get going. He's a priority start this week. Going a little deeper, I also really like Dallas Goedert, tight end 9 at the Saints. Luke Schoonmaker just had 6 catches for 43 yards against the Saints last week. And we've got the second highest game total on the slate. The Eagles are 2.5-point underdogs. There's no A.J. Brown with the hamstring injury. Can't think of a much better spot for a fantasy tight end than being the team's presumed number 2 target behind only Devonta Smith in a high game total as slight underdogs. So that's why we like Dallas Goedert this week. Folks, don't go anywhere. I've got some sits for you, and I've got that underdog pick 4 entry coming right up.
Hey, you're in your fantasy draft and someone says, hey, that guy's injury prone. I don't want him. And you're like, I don't know. I don't think you can predict injuries. Well, guess what? Now you can. Injury proneness is real. At Player Profiler, we have the data on these players, and it's all in the Injury Finder app. Their injury track record back through time, exactly where they were injured, how severe it is. We look at the BMI data, and we crunch it all together, and we give you probabilities that a player will miss multiple games this NFL season, as well as the complete database of NFL injuries and the ability to compare two players and look at their injury track record. The Injury Finder is powerful, and it's only $5. If it's worth it to have that peace of mind when you're drafting, go get it.
Welcome back, folks. I'm Josh Larky. This is the Dominator Start Sit Show. We just went through the starts. Let's talk about some sits and players I have below consensus, and then we will get to that underdog pick 4 entry. We've got someone in the chat asking about Hunter Henry. This is another one. I thought Jeff Wilson might do something last week when I was live pressed on the show. That didn't age well on Thursday night. Here we go. Another Thursday night take. No, I am not flexing Hunter Henry. That's what someone's asking about, is if we go Hunter Henry. If you start Hunter Henry and then flex McBride. No, I'd start McBride. I don't think we're flexing Hunter Henry. The game tonight, Thursday night football, is at 38.5 point over under. He faces the Jets. I'd be concerned. Anyway, quarterback, below consensus or sit. Anthony Richardson, quarterback 9 against the Bears, consensus. I'm not really sitting him, but I'm below consensus. I don't like this. Bears currently have the NFL's best defense. I think we just need to really temper expectations. The Bears right now are top 5 in highest quarterback pressure rate and top 5 in fewest yards per play allowed. Richardson hasn't even looked that good this year. Baker Mayfield, quarterback 13 by consensus against the Broncos. A lot of you are riding Baker. You want to start him. I would not. The Broncos kept Geno Smith to under 7 yards per pass attempt and 171 yards in week 1. Fields threw for just 117 yards last week on under 6 yards per attempt. The game total here is just 40 points. It could be a much slower game without as much scoring upside. The Buccaneers faced the Commanders in week 1 and then the Lions in week 2. This is a far different matchup for them to face the Broncos. It's going to be a slow-paced game. Baker's just trending towards sit status for this week. We'll discuss him more in a little bit. Maybe. All right. Kyren Williams, running back 14 by consensus against the 49ers. I don't like that. He's got a brutal 2.5 yards per carry on the year. Somehow he's averaging 19 touches, but only 53 yards per game total. He scored a touchdown in each game. That kind of buoyed his fantasy points. The Rams have a struggling offensive line, a very low team total. They got nothing in the receiving game to make the Niners respect them. It's all bad. Another sit, J.K. Dobbins, running back 22 by consensus at the Steelers. Go to Underdog Fantasy and look. You'll see Dobbins' rush yards line is that it's in the 40s. It's in the 40s, folks. Dobbins has no receiving role. He has 4 total receiving yards through 2 games. If his rush yards over unders like 48.5, 49.5, well, what the heck are we doing? Chargers had the 5th lowest team total on the week at 17.5 points. They're underdogs. The game total overall is just 36 points. Dobbins only has 13.5 carries a game. He's got 10 yards per carry. Oh, okay. 10 yards per carry. That's not going to last. His 17 carries last week tied a career high. I just don't think the Chargers are going to give him 20, 22, 25 carries when they know that he so recently tore his Achilles. And as a committee back for the first few seasons of his career, he kept getting injured anyway. I think you're looking at 10 to 15 carries. You're hoping for 4 yards per carry. You cross your fingers that he scores. I mean, Gus Edwards even has more red zone carries than Dobbins this year. Oh, Josh, but what about last week? Dobbins had a great week 1. I'm sure he got red zone carries in week 2. Gus Edwards had 1 red zone carry last week. Dobbins did not get a red zone carry last week. Ezekiel Elliott, consensus RB32 versus the Ravens. Rico Dowdle had more carries than Zeke last week. Rico Dowdle ran 15 routes to Zeke's 17 last week. I don't know why we're starting a timeshare back against the Ravens when he might be losing his grip to Dowdle within the timeshare. Makes no sense. Receiver, Rashid Shaheed is the consensus wide receiver 25. Whoa. Against the Eagles. This is Rashid Shaheed's 17 game pace. 77 targets. Terrible. 60 catches. 1,437 receiving yards, 17 touchdowns. It is tough to be fantasy relevant each week when you're pacing for well under 100 targets. Wide receiver 25 is just crazy for this type of player. I'd rather start Diontae Johnson, who's wide receiver 34 by consensus. I want to start Diontae Johnson over Rashid Shaheed. That should not be a hot take. Apparently this week it's a hot take. Michael Pittman. He's a consensus wide receiver 27. He faces the Bears. I don't like this. Josh Downs is returning from his ankle injury. We get the NFL's best overall defense in the Bears. The Colts are 0-2 on the season. They've lost both games. Yet somehow Richardson's averaged a well below average 27 pass attempts per game. Pittman really needs heavy volume to be good in fantasy, just like last year with Gardner Minshew. I don't think he gets that this week. You're really just hoping he scores. And then you look and his anytime touchdown odd is plus 255, which is a 28% implied chance that he scores. It's bad right now for Michael Pittman. Xavier Worthy, wide receiver 30 by consensus at the Falcons. This one's scary. It's a Chiefs receiver. I'm leaning towards sit. 3 targets, 1 carry in week 1. He did score on 2 of his 3 touches. But then week 2, it caught up to him. 4 targets, 1 carry. 22 scoreless yards last week. I think we really just need a bigger role from him. We're probably a few weeks away from that still. I think we're just getting a little too excited because what we saw in week 1. Tight end, Mark Andrews is the consensus tight end 7 at the Cowboys. So week 1, we all know Isaiah Likely had over 100 yards and Andrews did nothing. Last week in a game, the Ravens ended up losing. When they needed Andrews, he ran just 70% as many routes as Zay Flowers. We had 34 routes run for Flowers, 32 routes run for Bateman. Andrews was at only 24. Isaiah Likely was at 17. That's pretty close. We're not really going to quote unquote sit Andrews, but he's the highest ranked player that I think is going to not meet expectations at tight end this week. On the season now, Flowers has 3 times as many targets as Andrews, 21-7. It's just tough with Andrews when you're in a lower volume pass offense and you don't even have a full stranglehold on the tight end 1 job and Isaiah Likely's there. It just doesn't look good for Andrews. I'm concerned. All right, folks, Underdog Picks. So far, we were 2 of 3 for our picks in week 1 and week 2. We're hitting at that 67% clip. We're 4-2, but we haven't made money yet, and that's unacceptable. It's time to do better. So I decided to increase the volume. Folks, I would not recommend increasing the volume and going from 3 to 4 picks if your bankroll truly depends on it. Going for longer shot parlay type picks is not the answer if you are completely broke. But if you are not, then listen up. I've got a fun one. So I'm taking Chuba Hubbard higher than 2.5 receptions this week. You get a spicy little flame for that one. Apparently that's like a hot take. Like, whoa, Chuba Hubbard. Whoa, you like his receptions? Whoa. Underdog's letting you know, like, whoa, slow down. That's a spicy pick. So we had 4 catches last week. Andy Dalton's not mobile. He's going to be under pressure from the Raiders and Max Crosby. Then we're going to take Kyle Pitts. We got one more higher coming up. Higher, 37.5 receiving yards. I mentioned the Chiefs were shredded by Isaiah Likely. Then the combination of Mike Gesicki, Eric All, Andrew Sample. Cousins looked much better last week. This is the game. This is the game for Kyle Pitts. I mentioned Baker Mayfield earlier in the show. We're coming right back to him. Baker Mayfield lower, 32.5 pass attempts. We're 2-0 on the lower this year with Baker. The Bucs are 6.5 point favorites in a game with a 40-point over-under. They're just not going to need to pass much against Denver. Geno Smith had 25 pass attempts week 1 against Denver. Fields just had 20 last week. There's just a lot going on that needs to go right for Baker Mayfield to hit higher than 32.5 pass attempts. And then Kyren Williams, we're just going to pounce on him once again. Lower, 66.5 rushing yards. That's a lot of yards. He's at 30 carries for just 75 yards on the season. He had 12 carries for 25 yards last week, 18 carries for 50 yards in week 1. The Rams have no receivers. The Niners can key in on the Rams run game. And yeah, it was garbage time last week, but we saw Blake Corum get 8 carries. And he looks more dynamic than Kyren Williams. I think there's a chance they open up Corum's role a little bit more this week. There's just so many things that I'm concerned about right now with Kyren Williams in this offense. Those 4 picks, Chuba Hubbard, higher, 2.5 receptions. Kyle Pitts, higher, 37.5 receiving yards. Baker Mayfield, lower than 32.5 pass attempts. And Kyren Williams, lower than 66.5 rushing yards. Those 4 picks can 10.6x your money. So you put in $10, you could win $106. Promo code Underworld. Get that deposit match of 50%. If you're new to the platform, I'm Josh Larky. This is the Dominator. This is the Start Sit Show, bright and early on a Thursday morning. Thank you, everyone.
Hey, I want to thank you for being part of this broadcast. If you have any thoughts on it, leave a comment. If you enjoyed it, make sure you leave a like. And if you want to see more shows on the Player Profiler channel, subscribe to it. That's how we know you want more.